Good afternoon. We're pleased with the turnout today. On behalf of the entire Moritz Federalist Society, my name is Iman Sharma, and I'd like to welcome you to our event today. Our debate today is entitled Toke It or Leave It? Drug legalization, is it a noble goal or should it be up in smoke? And features two of the top legal scholars in the field of criminal law. I began today just by giving you guys a brief introduction to what our format is. It is our first debate, so we haven't done this before. And then I'll give an introduction to each speaker, and we'll get started from there. So with the debate, usually our guest speaker will be speaking first, but at Mr. Otis' request, Professor Berman will be speaking first. So speaking first, of course, will be Professor Berman. He'll be speaking in favor of drug legalization. He'll have initial 12 minutes to give an introduction. He'll be followed by Professor Otis, and he'll have 12 minutes to give his introduction. This will be followed by a 10-minute rebuttal, and finally we'll have questions to be taken from the audience. We'll give a brief introduction for each speaker before we get going. Professor Otis is an adjunct professor at Georgetown Law School. He's a blogger on the conservative website Crime and Consequences. He's a graduate of Stanford Law School, class of 1974. For most of his professional career, he was the head of the appellate division for the U.S. Attorney's Office in the Eastern District of Virginia. In that capacity, he argued over 100 cases before the federal courts of appeals. Among other posts he's held in the federal government, he was the special White House counsel for President George H.W. Bush, and most recently, he was counselor to the head of the Drug Enforcement Administration. He's an occasional contributor to op-ed pieces for the Washington Post, and he's been interviewed on 60 Minutes, The O'Reilly Factor, MSNBC, and several other syndicated programs. He's also testified before Congress as an expert in criminal law. He views his principal accomplishments, however, as being outside the law. He's married to Berman Otis, co-founder of the Federalist Society. We're very thankful for her for that. And he's one of the few people to have survived liver cancer. Doug Berman, of course, is probably very well known to many of us. He's the William B. Saxby Designated Professor of Law. Professor Berman graduated from Harvard Law School after attending Princeton for his undergraduate work. After his graduation from law school in 1993, Professor Berman served as a law clerk for Judge John Newman and then for Judge Guido Calabresi, both at the United States Court of Appeals in the Second Circuit. After clerking, Professor Berman was a litigation associate for the law firm Paul Weiser, Klein Wharton, and Garrison in New York City. This has unfortunately rendered him a Yankees fan, even though the Phillies will go ahead to win the World Series this year. Probably defeating them, hopefully again.
Just like last year.
Yeah.
Oh, wait a minute.
Thanks. Professor Berman, perhaps probably best known to people outside of Moritz for his widely read and widely cited web blog, Sentencing Law and Policy. He also works as a consultant to other lawyers working in cutting-edge aspects of the criminal law and criminal sentencing. And not surprisingly, Professor Berman's principal research work is in the area of criminal sentencing, and he's the co-author of a casebook entitled Sentencing Law and Policy, Cases, Statutes, and Guidelines. Now it's in its second edition. In addition to authoring numerous publications, he also serves as the co-managing editor of the Ohio State Journal of Criminal Law. Please welcome me and join me in welcoming Professor Doug Berman.
Well, I just want to say thanks to Iman and thanks to everybody for coming. I think this is an extraordinarily important topic and one in which I've probably not even given enough thought to have the honor of presenting one side of the position, and in fact, I won't present it in a way that I think a number of folks who are pro-drug legalization will. I think I'll present it in a more compelling way. And I will do so by encouraging everyone in this audience, encouraging everyone engaged by this public policy debate to readily concede drugs are dangerous. So are firearms, so are cars, so are dogs, so is rap music, so is speech, so is a lot of things that we do. And the exact nature of their danger, subject to lots of debate, whether the danger is worth the risk, subject to lots of debate. I want to encourage everybody not only to recognize drugs are not radically different than every other thing that we encounter and engage in our daily lives, but also that it is important, and I think in some sense critical to have this debate effectively, to remain quite open-minded about the dangers that drugs generally pose, and also to remain preciously aware of how many drugs, despite their dangers, we not only enjoy, but benefit dramatically from, whether that drug is, and again, I don't want to disrespect my colleague in saying the remarkable achievement of surviving cancer, but I assume drugs were used in that process, and it probably was an awfully good thing that they were legalized drugs, not illegal drugs. Drugs, I took some drugs this morning, legal drugs with prescription, right? There's drugs in the sodas you're drinking. Caffeine, I think, is rightly considered a drug. Certainly the nicotine that's in tobacco, certainly the chemicals that are in marijuana or heroin, which of course has legal versions in various sorts, certainly OxyContin, perhaps one of the most dangerous drugs. I'll be very candid and honest here, a drug that I think partially contributed to my mother's death. Legal, abused, dangerous, scary, like all drugs, like cars, which kill 40,000 people a year, like guns, which actually kill much fewer, like dogs, which bite people and kill some. I think an SUV, I think I got an email this morning that an SUV hit a 10-year-old crossing the street in outskirts of Columbus. Fortunately, I don't think anybody's going to say, therefore we should prohibit my SUV. Because we recognize in all serious and sensible policy debates that just because something is dangerous and harmful doesn't necessarily mean that we should prohibit it. In fact, I think to our great credit, our instinct is, both as a matter of American traditional history and as our commitment to liberty and limited government, let's let it be done. Let's let individuals seek on their own to get the benefits and minimize the burdens of these dangerous but potentially beneficial substances before we have the government intervene and say, we'll do the cost-benefit analysis for you. More importantly, and this is really what drives my own disaffinity for drug prohibition, we've tried to prohibit the potentially most serious and certainly most costly drug in American political and social history. It's called alcohol. We tried, and amazingly and tellingly and importantly, we didn't just try through standard legislative means to prevent human liberty from going. We collectively passed a constitutional amendment. Our feelings were that strong, our commitment to the belief that the dangers were so great and the benefits so minimal. We made a change in our fundamental founding document to prohibit any individual and any political entity from allowing the production, sale, transportation of alcohol. And one of the things that's worth keeping in mind is maybe that was a good choice. We may have saved a lot of lives. My sense is, particularly as the temperance movement made a big deal about women's rights and children's rights in trying to prevent men from getting drunk and beating their wives and their children and failing to go to their jobs, we may have short-term, long-term. We may still today benefit from prohibiting alcohol. I encourage you again to be open-minded to the cost-benefit analysis. But I think we sensibly chose, especially after we saw in full gory detail, I think that's going to be shown on an HBO series coming up soon, how much corruption, how much bad government has a way of, and also bad individual behavior, has a way of exploiting the harms of big government and liberty deprivation that comes with prohibiting something that's dangerous, but that we want to do. And I think whether it's the data on drug use, whether it's the desire we have of having fun with our friends and not just using alcohol or tobacco or cars or guns to have that fun, it seems as though people want to take drugs. And so the question for me isn't, how do we prevent people from taking drugs? I don't think we can through law. I think we can and should have the law be responsible in thinking through whether prohibition as opposed to regulation, as opposed to no law at all, is the right compromise. And what I feel particularly confident about, and this is an easy thing for me to say in this context, is it's time to try an alternative to prohibition. That's not I mean this to be a very modest advocacy for drug legalization. That's not a pitch for a radical shift in the way in which we approach drugs as a menace to our society. It is a belief that prohibition has not been so indisputably successful over the last 40 years, that it has had a variety of costs and pernicious effects, that let's try out in our laboratories of democracy a different way. And I'm very hopeful, and in fact I think I'm signing a letter expressing this point, that Proposition 19 will pass in California to allow California to experiment, every pun intended there, whether they'll inhale or not, we'll see, experiment with marijuana legalization. We want to call it decriminalization or elimination of prohibition. There's lots of terms of art, and as lawyers or future lawyers, you all should know how important the terminology and the rhetoric is. But let's give it a try. Fortunately, as we learned with prohibition as a constitutional matter, even if we were to enact our experiments in this respect in the Constitution, we can, and I suspect we would, change course if it's obvious we've made a mistake. What's a shame, and I think a significant shame in the context of this debate, is very few people have the courage right now to even acknowledge the possibility that drug prohibition has proven to be a mistake. And again, it may not be. Repealing prohibition may have been a mistake, all things considered. But again, I encourage folks to both be humble and open-minded about what the evidence might show, and look back on our both social and constitutional history to think that when the calls are close, when the questions are debatable, we as a country and as a people do better to err on the side of individual freedom, limited government, and free market principles. And all of those, I think, support the idea of letting every drug be controlled like the drugs the drug companies now control. Which is to say, you can mass market it, and you can advertise it, and you have to disclose all of the risks. And lots of people will spend lots of time trying to make sure OxyContin doesn't end up in the wrong hands, and only ends up in the right hands. And that won't be perfect. More kids will have access to it. More people will be smoking. But just like I don't look at the fact that some kids have access to alcohol, or that some kids drive too fast, or that some kids sadly play with guns in harmful ways, the fact that it may produce some more harms, not just to all of us, but to kids in particular, itself isn't alone a reason to justify continuing on a path that at the very least is costly, and at the worst is preventing us from becoming the full, flourishing individuals that I think the greatness of American exceptionalism allows us all to be. Thank you.
Now, when you come out from Washington to debate the William D. Saxby Professor of Law at the William D. Saxby Auditorium before quite a number of his present and former students, with the William D. Saxby Professor of Law's picture outside the auditorium as well, you probably should be checked as to what you've been smoking. Nonetheless.
Here at Ohio State, we understand about home field advantage very well.
I didn't start out being a drug warrior. I was just, for the most part of my career, I was an assistant U.S. attorney. You know, I did my share of drug cases, but had no particular stake beyond what any federal prosecutor would have in drug law. So I just want to start off by telling you what made me become kind of in stone on it. At one point in my career, 7 years ago, I became the counselor to the head of the Drug Enforcement Administration. Now that's kind of a highfalutin position. It's a presidential appointment. One of the things we would do at DEA is each year we would have a memorial service for agents and other employees who have been killed in the line of duty.